You learned somewhere along the way that love was something you had to earn. Not that it was freely given, not that you were wanted simply for existing, but that there was a price, and the price was being good enough, being impressive enough, being useful, agreeable, successful, or flawless enough that no one could find a reason to withdraw. And so you became a person organized around the avoidance of that withdrawal. You learned to perform, to achieve, to anticipate what others needed, and deliver it before they had to ask. You built a self so polished that it could not be rejected, because you understood, at a level deeper than thought, that the unpolished version, the real one, was not safe to show. This is perfectionism, not the harmless quirk of liking things tidy or taking pride in your work. The real thing, the exhausting, unrelenting inner demand that you be more than human in order to deserve what should have been given freely. And underneath it is a lie so deeply installed that you have probably never examined it because it doesn't feel like a belief. It feels like reality. The lie is this, that if you can just become perfect enough, you will finally be loved. That the flawless version of you is the lovable one, and the real one has to be hidden, improved, or apologized for. Karen Horney, one of the most penetrating psychologists of the 20th century, spent her career taking this lie apart. She understood perfectionism not as a personality trait, but as a wound, a strategy developed in childhood to survive a love that came with conditions. And what she discovered is that the strategy doesn't just fail to get you the love you're seeking. It makes that love structurally impossible to receive. The perfect self you built to become lovable is the very thing standing between you and being loved. Karen Horney was a German-American psychoanalyst who trained in the Freudian tradition and then broke from it, becoming one of the most important independent voices in the history of depth psychology. She challenged Freud on numerous points, but her most significant contribution was a fundamental reorientation of where neurosis comes from. Freud located the roots of psychological suffering largely in biological drives and their repression. Horney located them somewhere more human and, for our purposes, more useful, in relationships, in the emotional environment of childhood, and specifically in whether or not the child received genuine warmth. Horney's central idea begins with what she called basic anxiety, the feeling of being isolated and helpless in a world that feels potentially hostile. Every child, she argued, is vulnerable to this. And what protects a child from it is not perfect parenting, but genuine warmth and reliable affection, the felt sense of being loved and welcomed as they actually are. When that warmth is present, the child develops a fundamental security, a sense that they are okay, and the world is basically safe. When it is absent, when love is conditional, inconsistent, withheld, or contingent on performance, the child is left exposed to basic anxiety and must develop strategies to cope with it. Perfectionism, in Horney's framework, is one of those strategies. The child who senses that love must be earned does not simply give up. Children are extraordinarily resourceful in their bids for connection. Instead, the child sets out to become the kind of person who will be loved, to close the gap between who they are and who they believe they need to be in order to finally receive what every child needs. They begin constructing an image of a perfect self, an idealized version that would, at last, be worthy. And they begin, at the same time, to reject and disown the real self, the ordinary, imperfect, needful self that seemed to be the reason love was withheld in the first place. This is the origin of the lie. The child concludes, not in words but in the deep logic of a developing psyche, that the real self is the problem and the idolized self is the solution. that being loved is a matter of successfully becoming someone other than who you are. And this conclusion, formed in childhood under real emotional pressure, becomes the invisible operating system of an entire adult life. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. At the center of Horney's understanding of perfectionism are two concepts that, once you grasp them, are almost impossible to unsee in your own life. The first is the idealized self. The second is what she memorably called the tyranny of the should. The idealized self is the image of perfection the person constructs and comes to identify with. It is not a realistic goal or a healthy aspiration. It is a fantasy of a self with no weaknesses, no limitations, no shameful needs. A self that is flawless in whatever terms the person's particular history made important. For one person, the idealized self is infinitely competent and successful. For another, it is endlessly kind and selfless. For another, it is brilliant or strong or unfailingly independent. The specific content varies, but the structure is the same. It is an image of a being who has transcended the ordinary human condition of limitation and need, and who would therefore, finally, be beyond rejection. The problem is that the person does not hold the idealized self as a distant aspiration. They come to believe they should actually be it. And this is where the tyranny of the should enters. Horney observed that the neurotic person lives under the rule of a vast, cruel system of internal demands. I should always be productive. I should never be tired. I should be able to handle anything. I should never need help. I should be liked by everyone. I should never make mistakes. I should be happy. These shoulds are not gentle preferences. They are absolute commands, and failure to meet them is met not with understanding but with harsh self-condemnation. The person becomes their own tyrant, ruling over themselves with a set of impossible standards and punishing every failure to reach them. The tyranny of the should is exhausting in a way that is difficult to convey to someone who doesn't live inside it. It means there is no rest, because there is always another should being violated. It means that accomplishments bring no lasting peace, because the standard immediately rises. It means that ordinary human states, tiredness, uncertainty, need, imperfection, are experienced not as normal, but as failures, as evidence that you are falling short of the self you're supposed to be. The person under the tyranny of the should is at war with their own humanity, perpetually condemning themselves for being a limited human being rather than the limitless ideal they've come to believe they must be. And all of it, Horney understood, is in the service of that original bid for love. The idealized self was constructed to be lovable. The shoulds are the rules for becoming it. The entire brutal apparatus is, at its root, a child's desperate strategy for finally earning the acceptance that was never freely given, carried into adulthood, turned against the self, and mistaken for simply having high standards. Here is the cruel irony at the heart of the whole structure, the thing that makes perfectionism not just painful, but self-defeating. The strategy developed to secure love actively prevents the person from ever receiving it. And it does so through several mechanisms that are worth making explicit, because seeing them clearly is the beginning of freedom. The first mechanism is that perfectionism ensures the real self is never seen. Love, actual love, is a relationship between two real people. It requires being known, being seen in your ordinary, unpolished, imperfect actuality, and being welcomed there. But the perfectionist cannot allow this. The entire strategy is built on hiding the real self and presenting the idealized one. So even when love is offered, it cannot land, because it is being offered to a performance. The perfectionist watches people respond warmly to the polished image and concludes, correctly, that they are loving someone who isn't real, which means the love, however genuine, cannot touch the place that actually needs it. The person is loved and feels underneath, completely unseen, because they are. The second mechanism is that perfectionism makes receiving love feel dangerous. If your worth is conditional on being flawless, then any moment of being seen as flawed is a threat to your very lovability. So the perfectionist becomes vigilant, defended, unable to be vulnerable. And vulnerability is the doorway through which love enters. To be loved, you have to let someone see you, need someone, risk being disappointing. All of these are intolerable to a psyche organized around the belief that imperfection means rejection. The perfectionist keeps others at exactly the distance that feels safe, which is always a little too far away for real intimacy to occur. The third mechanism is perhaps the most painful. Because the perfectionist cannot love themselves, cannot accept their own real, imperfect self. They cannot fully believe in anyone else's love for them either. Horney understood that the idealized self has a shadow twin: self-hatred. The person who worships an impossible image of who they should be necessarily despises the real self that keeps failing to be it. And a person consumed by self-hatred cannot receive love because it contradicts their deepest conviction about themselves. When love is offered, it is filtered through the belief that the real self is unlovable, and so it is discounted, doubted, or experienced as something that would surely be withdrawn if the person only knew the truth. The perfectionist is haunted by the fear of being found out, the sense that their lovability rests on a deception that could collapse at any moment. So the structure is complete and self-sealing. Perfectionism hides the real self, making genuine love impossible to receive. It makes vulnerability feel dangerous, closing the door through which love enters, and it breeds a self-hatred that discounts whatever love does arrive. The strategy for becoming lovable becomes an airtight system for remaining, no matter how much love surrounds you, fundamentally unloved. Not because love isn't available, but because you have made yourself unable to let it in. To understand the way out, you have to understand what Horney meant by the real self, because it is the thing the entire perfectionistic structure was built to escape. And it is also the only thing that can be genuinely loved. The real self, in Horney's language, is not the idealized image, and it is not the collection of coping strategies. It is the living core of the person, their actual feelings, their genuine desires, their spontaneous responses, their authentic values, the unique and particular human being they actually are beneath all the performance. Horney believed the real self is the source of genuine growth, what she sometimes described using the image of an acorn that contains within it the pattern of the oak. The real self is the part of you that wants to become what you actually are, rather than what you think you should be. Perfectionism is, in the most precise sense, alienation from this real self. The person becomes so identified with the idealized image, so ruled by the shoulds, so committed to the performance, that they lose contact with what they actually feel and want and are. Ask a lifelong perfectionist what they genuinely desire, apart from what they should desire, and you will often find a startling blankness. The real self has been overruled for so long that its voice has become almost inaudible. The person knows what they're supposed to want, supposed to feel, supposed to be. What they actually want and feel and are has been buried under decades of self-improvement in the service of a love that the improvement was never going to deliver. This is the real tragedy of the lie. In trying to become the lovable, idealized self, the person abandons the real self, which is the only self that could ever actually be loved. The idealized self cannot be loved because it isn't real. It's an image, a performance, a fantasy. Only the real self, in all its ordinary imperfection, is available for the genuine encounter that love requires. So the perfectionist has it exactly backwards. They believe the real self is the obstacle to love, and the idealized self is the path to it. In fact, the idealized self is the obstacle, and the real self, the very thing they've spent their life hiding, is the only thing that was ever lovable in the first place. Horney was a clinician, and her work points toward real change, though she was honest that it is deep work rather than a quick fix. The movements below are the heart of what undoing this actually requires. The first is to recognize the idealized self as a construction rather than a truth. The perfectionist experiences their impossible standards as simply reality, as the way things are and the way they must be. The first liberating move is to see the idealized self for what it is, an image built in childhood to solve a problem that no longer exists, in a bid for love from people who are no longer the gatekeepers of your worth. When you notice the crushing sense that you should be more, achieve more, never falter, recognize that this is not truth speaking. It is the idolized self, the old construction, demanding you keep chasing a perfection that was never the actual path to love. Naming it as a construction begins to loosen its claim on you. The second movement is to catch the shoulds and question them directly. Horney's tyranny of the should operates most powerfully when it's invisible, when the commands feel like your own considered values rather than internalized demands. Begin listening for the word should, spoken or implied, in your own inner voice. I should be handling this better. I shouldn't need help. I should be further along. Each time you catch one, ask where it came from and whether you actually endorse it or whether it's simply a rule you absorbed in the service of an old and impossible standard. The shoulds lose power when they are examined, because most of them cannot survive being looked at directly. They depend on being obeyed automatically, never questioned. The third movement is to practice being seen in your imperfection, deliberately, in small and survivable ways. The perfectionist's core belief is that imperfection leads to rejection, and this belief has never been allowed to be tested because the imperfection has always been hidden. The only way to disprove it is through experience. This means gradually and with people who are reasonably safe, allowing yourself to be seen as less than perfect. Admitting you don't know something, letting a need show, making a mistake and not frantically covering it, being tired, uncertain, ordinary in front of another person. Each time you do this and are not rejected, each time you are, in fact, met with warmth precisely in the moment of imperfection, you are gathering the evidence that dismantles the lie. You are learning, in the only way it can be truly learned, that the real self is not, in fact, unlovable. The fourth movement is to turn toward the real self and begin listening for it again. After years or decades of overruling it, the real self's voice is faint, and recovering it takes patience. It means asking, in small moments, not what you should want, but what you actually want. Not what you should feel, but what you actually feel. It means giving weight to your genuine responses, even the inconvenient ones, even the ones that don't fit the idealized image. Horney believed the real self has its own momentum toward growth, that when you stop overruling it and start attending to it, it begins slowly to come back to life. And as it does, something remarkable becomes possible. You begin to be present as who you actually are, and only then, for the first time, does real love have something real to reach. Alongside all of this runs a quieter, deeper movement, the gradual replacement of self-hatred with something like self-compassion. Not the self-congratulation of the idealized self, but a genuine, ordinary kindness toward the real, limited, imperfect human being you actually are. This is the ground the whole recovery rests on, because in the end, the capacity to receive love from others is inseparable from the capacity to stop condemning yourself for failing to be something no human being was ever meant to be. The lie perfectionism told you was that love is earned by becoming flawless, that somewhere beyond the next achievement, the next improvement, the final elimination of your weaknesses, there waits the acceptance you've been reaching for your whole life. And you believed it, because it was installed early, under real pressure, by a childhood in which love genuinely did seem to come with conditions. It was not a stupid conclusion. It was the intelligent adaptation of a child doing their best to secure something they needed to survive. But you are not that child anymore, and the conclusion that helped you then imprisons you now. Because the truth Horney spent her life uncovering is the exact inverse of the lie. Love is not earned by perfection. It is made impossible by it. The flawless self you've been building is not the lovable one. It is a wall, an image, a performance that no one can actually reach through. And the real self you've spent your life hiding, apologizing for, trying to improve out of existence, is not the obstacle to being loved. It is the only thing that ever could be loved. Love has been standing at the door the whole time, and perfectionism has been the thing keeping it out. To be loved, you do not need to become more. You need to become visible. You need to let the real self, ordinary, imperfect, needful, unfinished, be seen, which is the one thing the whole perfectionistic structure was designed to prevent. This is terrifying because it means risking the rejection you've spent your life avoiding. But it is the only path, because a love given to the idealized self can never satisfy the real one. And the real one is the only one who is actually here. You were never unlovable. You were only hidden. The person you've been so afraid to let anyone see, the flawed, striving, tired human person underneath the performance, was the one worth loving all along. And the moment you begin to let that person exist, to be seen, to be met, you discover that the thing you've been chasing through a lifetime of perfectionism was never at the end of the striving. It was underneath it, waiting, all this time, for you to stop performing long enough to let it in.